One of the few unambiguously good things about modern gaming has been the rise of backwards compatibility as a feature. Historically, this just wasn't really a huge priority. Back in the day when games came on cartridges, they were only really built to be compatible with that specific console, and intergenerational compatibility wasn't really a top priority in the face of developers having to answer the question, how do we manage to jam our entire game into a cartridge that can only hold about 2/3 of this video's thumbnail on a good day? Future-proofing likewise wasn't really a major consideration back in the early console generations, and that was for a few reasons. For one, the advancements in hardware from one generation to the next were often so dramatic that it would be genuinely worth it to sell a remaster that could take advantage of the upgrades. For another, consumer-level computer hardware just wasn't exactly what modern hardware is. Modern backwards compatibility frequently just involves the console running an emulator of the older console's system, and good luck putting that shit on an SNES. For a third, the hardware that the games themselves were sold on was also rapidly improving, and that changed how you both played and made games. Save states powered by a cartridge-based battery, for example, only emerged in the third console generation in 1985. In the first two generations, you either had to beat it all in one go, or you'd be given a password that would skip you to a certain point in the game. For a fourth, the older console generations were also a lot scrappier, with a lot more turnover in terms of companies even sticking around from one generation to another, so backwards compatibility was kind of a moot question when the company's ability to even live long enough to have to think about it was up in the air. Since the 7th console generation started 20 years ago, only 3 companies have really been big names in the console space. Nintendo, which has been around since the 3rd generation, Sony, which has been around since the 5th, and Microsoft, which has been around since the 6th. In the first couple generations, it wasn't really worth thinking in terms of, should we make this new console backwards compatible with the old one? Or how can we make sure this generation's games can be played on whatever comes next? Because all those other factors really lined up in a way to make competition a lot more fierce and required them to focus on winning the current war rather than just revisiting old battles. That changed over time though, particularly when it came to handhelds where cartridge standardization was just a lot more feasible. Original Game Boy games could be played on a Game Boy Color games could be played on Game Boy Advances, Game Boy Advance games could be played on the DS and DS Lite, DS games could be played on the 3DS, etc. When it comes to home consoles, a lot of this comes down to a handful of factors relating to the hardware standardizing. Namely, everyone getting on board with normal-sized discs starting in the 6th console generation with the exception of Nintendo, who decided to keep being quirky and different and not like other girls with the GameCube. They fell in line after that with the Wii and Wii U, but then went back to cartridges with the Switch and the Switch 2. Nowadays, backwards compatibility is super common, and it goes beyond just having an old disc that you can put in a new console. You can find a lot of games from past console generations available for a digital download or through a subscription service on modern consoles if you didn't already own them, bugs and all included. And a ton of old discs can be popped into new consoles and will still play just fine. Provided the console, uses discs anyways, meaning it's mostly just Sony and Microsoft and only for their ones that actually have disc drives. It's explicitly part of the pitch for new consoles these days, with the Switch 2, Xbox Series S and X, and PlayStation 5 all emphasizing their backwards compatibility features in marketing and promotion. And the availability of old games via online stores or services like Game Pass is a major selling point of them as well. Microsoft made it a small but explicit part of its pitch for the Series S and X that you'd be able to play Fusion Frenzy on the new consoles, which is insane given that Fusion Frenzy was a launch title for the original Xbox that never got a sequel. No sequel exists. I will not acknowledge fake news to the contrary. Don't try. It's one of the few genuinely good things that Microsoft in particular are doing these days, and while I really do appreciate Microsoft allowing me to play my favorite childhood game well into my 20s, card in the top right if you want to hear me rant about Fusion Frenzy by the way, it unfortunately doesn't really balance out their anti-consumer practices. And also the genocide that they're complicit in. Anyways, conspicuously absent here is Nintendo, probably the worst company for backwards compatibility in the industry right now. Part of that is undeniably that they like making money from remakes and re-releases and reselling you the same game over and over again rather than allowing you to keep playing your old games on new consoles, especially for their biggest franchises like Pokemon. And it's not like they never did it. Again, on handheld, they were really good about it, and you could still play GameCube games on the Wii and stuff like that. However, even then, Nintendo has some glaring absences from their catalog of games, especially from the DS era. Stuff like Nintendogs, Pokemon Ranger, and the subject of this video, Elite Beat Agents, are all absent from modern Nintendo consoles, either via backwards compatibility, remakes, or even just modern sequels. And it's not like it's impossible to figure out why. Nintendo, more than any other console maker of the 21st century, loves a gimmick. They never miss a chance to try something new and goofy with their consoles, and it's undeniably been a huge boon both for them and the gaming space at large. Compared to both Microsoft and Sony, Nintendo punches way above its weight class, particularly in terms of the cultural impact of its products. The problem is that not every gimmick is worth preserving forever, and that can be for a variety of reasons. Some, like the GameCube's tiny discs, just weren't well suited to an era where games were getting bigger but companies couldn't necessarily rely on consumers being able to download a day one patch. Others, like the old school Virtual Boy, were just clearly ahead of their time given the rise of modern VR. And some, like the dual screen and stylus-based touchscreen of the Nintendo DS, were just a necessary sacrifice to advance to the next evolutionary stage of the consoles. Now, basic history lesson that I'm sure most of you are aware of, but the Wii U flopped tremendously when it came out. Like, colossal flop, historic flop. It was the woman's world of the 8th console generation and raised serious questions about whether Nintendo had a future in the home console market at all. In hindsight, that's pretty funny given the Switch, but at the time, it really seemed like they might have finally lost their edge. As well, in combination with this, handheld gaming consoles were also in a rough spot as mobile games continued to edge them out of the market. I mean, obviously an iPhone isn't a substitute for the games you could get on a Game Boy, but importantly, a huge portion of the customer base for Game Boy were children who didn't get a say in what amount of the household budget they were allowed to allocate to video game consoles. And if you forced the average 16-year-old in 2014 to decide between an iPhone and a Game Boy for a Christmas present, they're picking the iPhone every day of the week. So Nintendo made the move to the Switch mid-generation, which eliminated the distinction between handheld and home consoles by making one that could do both. It undeniably changed the game, but it came with the question of what parts of Nintendo's handheld and home consoles would be sacrificed to make the hybrid thing work. And frankly, most of those sacrifices came from the handheld side. Gone were the dual screens that had been Nintendo's standard from 2004 to 2020 when it was finally discontinued, and gone was the stylus-based gameplay. The Switch and Switch 2 both only have a single screen, and while it is a touchscreen, it's not stylus-based. It uses your finger, and it's a lot less precise and more finicky. And this is where we get to Elite Beat Agents. EBA is a rhythm action game developed for the Nintendo DS and released in 2007, using the stylus on the bottom screen to tap numbered circles along with the rhythm, indicated by outer rings that slowly close in on them. The narrative premise is that the people of the world of EBA need cheerleaders to get them through their daily struggles, and the Elite Beat Agents, or Elite Beat Divas if you can unlock them, serve as secret agents who fulfill this vital mission by dancing to Madonna covers to save a pair of rich heiresses who get stranded on a deserted island after a shipwreck, or to Skater Boy to help a taxi driver get a woman in labor to the hospital on time, or to Canned Heat to help a ninja break into a rival auto company's headquarters, or, and this is the most batshit premise in the game so it must be acknowledged here, a performance of You're the Inspiration for a little girl whose dad died on Christmas the previous year, and if they dance well enough, the ghost of her dad will come back and give her last year's Christmas gift as well as a final proper goodbye. As the game continues, eventually aliens show up and put an end to all dance, freezing the agents in stone and putting everyone in anti-dance work camps. However, all the people you've saved up until then will come together and bring you back to life to deal the death blow to the aliens via a really fun rendition of Jumpin' Jack Flash that's actually basically impossible on mouse and keyboard if you're curious. And you should be curious because that brings us to the core issue here. Namely, that EBA is a game that's probably lost to us forever. Or at least lost to us forever in its existing playstyle thanks to changing console gimmicks. It's a game that really requires a stylus-based touchscreen to be functional and responsive. Fingers are too big and imprecise, and your hand's going to cover too much of the screen to be able to see what's coming. It's not a game that super requires the dual screen setup though. It's certainly enhanced by it, using the top screen to show different scenes of the people who are calling for help either succeeding or failing as a reflection of how well the EBA are cheering them on, but it doesn't require it. And a lot of what we talked about so far has harped on Nintendo, and for good reason. But it is worth remembering that everyone can be guilty of this. Microsoft and Sony both flirted with motion controls back during the 7th and 8th console generations with the Kinect and PlayStation Move, and all of those games are functionally dead forever now that that fad's over with and they stopped supporting it. Dance Central, a personal favorite of mine from the Kinect era, is actively disappearing both because the Kinect has been abandoned and because the licenses for the songs, especially DLC songs, are expiring, meaning that unless you already own them, they're probably just gone forever. What's more, while you could pretty easily argue that Nintendo is indisputably the biggest offender on this front, it's also because Nintendo is a lot more experimental than Microsoft and Sony are. Xbox and PlayStation have ultimately been pretty consistent for the entirety of the 21st century. Like, even the controllers, it's pretty easy to tell where they came from. Whereas Nintendo has been willing to take risks and try something new a lot. And to be clear, it has absolutely made gaming better. A lot of us would have had worse childhoods without the gimmicks of the GameCube, the Game Boy, the Wii, or the Switch. And that brings up an interesting point in all this. Is it really fair to blame Nintendo for continuing to try and innovate and to change things up? Do they have an obligation to make sure that the weird and wacky and incredible games that they've made and that they've had made for their consoles that rely on their own unique gimmicks are able to be future-proofed? Do we really want that to happen? Because that wouldn't necessarily mean that we get better games either. It just might mean that they stop making some of those innovative weird games for those innovative weird consoles. This is similar to something that certain content creators and industry lobbying groups have actually argued when talking about Stop Killing Games, a movement in Europe to make sure that your games can't just be killed off when they're no longer profitable for a company, even if you've paid money for them. They've argued that this sort of policy change to prohibit this would ultimately just prevent companies from making these sorts of games, which is a cope. These games make too much money to not keep making them. It just means that they have an obligation to actually maintain the games themselves or allow them to be maintained by someone else, rather than just grabbing your cash and running off with it without providing the service that you paid for. However, when it comes to this sort of hardware compatibility thing, it can get trickier. I think the move from the DS and Wii console families to the Switch was a pretty undeniably good move, and I really love what the Switch has enabled for Nintendo when it comes to their games. If they'd been forced to maintain a dual screen system and a stylus-based touchscreen, would it really have been better? Would they have been willing to try and make something like the Switch if they would have had to accommodate that? Would there have been a willingness from developers and publishers back in the day to try and find ways to make sure that their weird gimmick games could always be backwards compatible? Because what I think is more likely is that we would have just gotten games that never tried to take advantage of these gimmicks in the first place, and that would have sucked. I love games like Dance Central for the Xbox Kinect, and I'm glad they made it, even if the Kinect is now dead. I loved Pokemon Rangers, even though I don't think they could ever replicate that on a Switch because of the lack of a stylus. I love Elite Beat Agents, even though it's also probably never coming back for the same reason. Hell, I even like Zero Escape 999, a game where the final puzzle is infamously ruined in the PC port because it relied on the Nintendo DS's clamshell design to allow it to close. There are games that relied on the DS's microphone, touchscreen, second screen, DS and GBA ports, Wi-Fi connectivity, short-range Bluetooth connections, and more, all in combination with one another to deliver really unique experiences to players. And I think a ton of games of the era would have been worse if they'd been forced to conform to something that could be guaranteed to be future-proof. This still raises a lot of questions for media preservation though, because this isn't something we've really had to meaningfully engage with before in history. Media preservation is infinitely easier now in the digital era than it ever has been, at least in theory, provided corporations don't just delete a piece of media's entire existence. Check out my video about the culling for more on that. But video games being interactive means that preserving the media has to also preserve the hardware it was presented on. It's possible to digitize a copy of an old movie or book or TV show and preserve it indefinitely, and while it won't be exactly the same as how it was initially presented, it'll still get pretty close. Like, we can go watch the original Wizard of Oz, you know? But how do you preserve Elite Beat Agents? You can't just preserve the software in a way that's non-interactive, because that's not really allowing the media to be perceived and engaged with as it's meant to be, is it? It's media embalming in the sense that it can keep the body intact, but it doesn't allow people to interact with the media in the way they were supposed to. A fundamental part of the experience of Elite Beat Agents is that it's a test of skill. That you are the one who did this challenging thing to ultimately give the people you're helping the support they needed to succeed. The satisfaction of the experience comes from achieving a goal yourself. If you can't interact with it, you can't achieve anything. So, what's the solution here? Is Nintendo obligated to continue manufacturing and selling DS consoles forever so that these games can't be lost to these changing console gimmicks? Should every future Xbox or PlayStation be required to have ports for every gimmicky controller, motion or otherwise, that they've ever allowed to be sold for their consoles? What should be the rule when it comes to physical copies of games? Should companies have an obligation to keep printing physical copies for people indefinitely? Actually, when it comes to that last one, I would love a service where retired games enter sort of a vault system where you can place an order for them to produce and mail you a physical copy of that game, but I don't know if any company would ever actually be willing to do that. And for digital copies, how do we preserve those? What happens if a company puts out an update that just bricks a game indefinitely and never has to go and fix it? And this doesn't just apply to consoles either. PCs have this issue too, just less about gimmicks and more about the inherent inconsistency of PC gaming. There are games that came out during my lifetime that can no longer be played on modern PCs without extensive modding. Even if you have a PC with a disk drive to insert old CD-ROMs, you might not still be able to boot up an old game because its programming language isn't supported properly. I mean, are programming languages gimmicks that can change? Who's to say? I would argue that to some degree it is a console gimmick because the console is no longer able to handle it if you consider a PC a console, but that's neither here nor there. I can't play the copy of Clue Murder at Body Mansion that I got out of a cereal box when I was 6 without basically installing an emulator of an older version of Windows onto my computer. And that's just not really accessible. And also, you're not really supposed to. Companies don't like it when you do that sort of thing. So there's really no legal way to preserve and maintain this sort of stuff sometimes. And what happens when the games themselves just die? Old cartridge-based consoles like the Game Boy use small batteries in the cartridges to preserve saves and memory. And those batteries can just die one day and delete everything. Should there be some way to upload and preserve those save files somewhere? Or to upgrade the cartridges themselves? You might say that a cartridge is a format, not a gimmick, but the two aren't wholly distinct. I mean, we've talked about a few examples already, but Boktai The Sun Is In Your Hand is a Game Boy Advance game that was built with a unique cartridge that included a light sensor, which you were supposed to use in the sunlight to power up the game's weapons. If that sounds ridiculous to you, which it does, it might make some more sense to you once you learn that it's actually a Kojima game. Regardless, that's a cartridge with a gimmick, and it's a gimmick that also requires the cartridge to be able to protrude from the console itself by a fair bit. It's not limited by a lack of a stylus-based touchscreen or a second screen, but by the format of game distribution and hardware design of the console itself. Even if a Switch port of it was created, the Switch isn't built to have its cartridges exposed to the air. Like, it has that little plastic cover thing that's meant to cover it. Thus, I think you can pretty safely argue that cartridges are at least capable of becoming a gimmick, and given that compatibility from one console to the next isn't guaranteed, I'd argue they count for our purposes here. This video isn't really about proving this point to you, because the point is basically a given, I think. We lose a lot of video games to changing console gimmicks, and video games as a medium are uniquely vulnerable to this sort of obsolescence via features being lost over console generations. I don't really think anyone on Earth would reasonably dispute that. The dispute would be around what, if anything, should be done about it. And that is a hard question to answer because there legitimately is not a precedent for it in really any artistic medium. This is another similarity it shares with Stop Killing Games and the push to end the ability of publishers to just erase a game from existence if it's not actively generating enough profit. There's not really a simple analogy to draw between video games and any other medium in the past. Sure, there's been media loss of formatting changes, the rise and fall of Betamax and then VHS after it also served to kill a whole bunch of media that's effectively trapped on them. Now that's very hard to access, so we've moved on to new formats. However, VHS actually provides a good reference for how to potentially do something about this. Namely, by allowing other companies to manufacture the hardware as well. It's actually pretty rare for companies to have the monopoly over both the media and the hardware necessary to experience the media outside of gaming. Even in media like film and television, where producers have historically tried to own their own distribution by buying up theater chains or television broadcasters or making their own streaming services, they still don't have a monopoly over the hardware that you can use to watch them. It's not like there's only one specific kind of hardware that can run Netflix that only Netflix manufactures, right? You can buy a device from any number of companies that can run a Netflix app, and while Netflix could always choose to make it impossible to run on certain devices, their incentive is to keep allowing companies to make the hardware for them. And this is kind of what happened with VHS way back in the day. See, JVC created the tech, but they weren't the only company that manufactured VCRs. Lots of companies did, same with the VHSs themselves. In fact, that's been the case for most media formats for the last half century outside of gaming and very rare exceptions like IMAX. Hell, part of what contributed to VHS's victory over Betamax was that it was functionally de facto open source tech, allowing for way more widespread adoption. Betamax, by contrast, was developed by Sony, and Sony doesn't share. If you wanted Betamax, you had to pay their prices, and nobody else could compete unless it was with Sony's explicit permission. And Betamax was objectively better by every metric aside from that. Quality, storage, all of it. But access gave VHS the win, because it meant that it would be just more logical to buy a VCR made by any number of companies since you'd know it could play VHSs beyond just what JVC made. And who knows, maybe this is a model for gaming going forward. When a console gets retired in favor of the next generation, maybe some patents could be loosened or just licensed out to allow for companies to keep manufacturing them. Sure, they wouldn't have huge demand, but for hobbyists, for kids, for a lot of people, that would still be something people want. Maybe this would allow consoles to continue having rich lives after their own generation ends, with games being made with new tech to run on old hardware. Or maybe even upgraded versions of the old hardware that enable things that never could have happened during the original console's lifespan. And it's not like that's not already kind of happening in some aspects of gaming. Namely, when it comes to controllers. Tons of companies are able to make and sell their own knockoff controllers, especially gimmicky ones, and while Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo would probably rather that you actually buy their colossally overpriced ones, they still do allow it to happen. The same thing could happen with the consoles themselves, especially after the end of a console's lifespan or the end of functional backwards compatibility for it. Maybe for as long as Nintendo is making Switches that are backwards compatible, they can hold on to those manufacturing rights, but once they inevitably move on to their next gimmick, they can license out the old systems to companies that could probably actually afford to manufacture them now while still turning a profit. Nobody really expects Nintendo to keep making DS consoles forever, indefinitely, regardless of demand and changing hardware, but JVC weren't the last ones making VCRs either. Maybe the issue with the comparison to Stop Killing Games is that movement is based around preserving fully digital software, something intangible and easy to rip away at the drop of a hat. What I'm talking about here is the preservation of hardware, something that is arguably harder to replace once the consoles themselves stop being made. In theory, you can find a ROM of just about any DS or Wii game you want online, and provided the internet manages to continue existing, something which seems increasingly unlikely if AI continues to turn it into the old web from Cyberpunk but lame and boring, then it's possible to find ways to preserve, protect, and share that media. I don't really know how to preserve Elite Beat Agents, or Pokemon Ranger, or any number of other games from my childhood that were, to me, iconic. Games that I would want to someday be able to show my kids if I have them. I don't want to have to rely on a $150 piece of hardware from 2008 to last indefinitely now that it's irreplaceable thanks to the end of manufacturing for it. And while I don't want infinite e-waste from companies producing consoles that get shoveled straight into landfills because nobody wants them, I also don't want to be left with a collection of old games that can never be experienced again because developers took risks and embraced the unique opportunities that certain consoles provided once those consoles are dead and gone. We live in a really interesting and really challenging era for media preservation, where the things that can make it easier to protect and preserve media, digital storage, globalized trade in media, and virtual commerce, are all constantly at risk of being corrupted by the profit motive and used against these things. It's also undeniably bad for the medium long term if we can't preserve games properly. Part of what enables every artistic medium to grow is that the creators of today can look back on the greats of decades or even centuries past to inform what they make in the present. Modern writers can still go back to Shakespeare and learn from him. Modern filmmakers can go back and watch Hitchcock films to build upon his innovations. Modern painters or sculptors or drawers can examine the old classics in museums and libraries to try and see what techniques they used. and then incorporate them into their own work. If you want to write a mystery story, you're not only able to go back through generations of mystery writing to explore how Arthur Conan Doyle or Agatha Christie or whoever else wrote their mysteries, but also how dozens of other artists have reinterpreted and re-examined their premises and concepts over the decades. You can watch House MD to see how Sherlock got turned into a medical mystery series. You can read or watch any number of renditions of And Then There Were None to see how different writers have replaced the slurs that Agatha Christie's original story included. But a rhythm action game designer of today has to put in a lot of work to be able to go back and learn about the rhythm action games of even just a couple decades ago. And it's not just Elite Beat Agents either. Rhythm action games are uniquely vulnerable to this sort of thing because even when they don't rely on console-specific gimmicks like EVA does, they still frequently rely on controller gimmicks. Sure, sometimes you can get a rhythm game that uses a standard controller like Fusion Frenzy's Rhythm, Mystery Beat, and Scratch Match minigames, but rhythm action games in particular are a genre where a lot of gimmicks live and thrive. Donkey Kong bongos and plastic guitars and dance mats and motion sensors and so much more fill the genre, and those controllers are often limited to a specific console. Even when they can be adapted for emulation, like being able to hook them up to a PC, that's still not particularly accessible. I can go find a licensed version of any Alfred Hitchcock movie I want on streaming services, but I can't go find an official ROM of any DS game that I can play on any official emulators. And for a lot of people, especially kids who might find their passions in these games, that makes them functionally inaccessible. I just really want to be able to play Elite Beat Agents again. Properly. I know I can play it as a ROM, but a fundamental part of the experience is having your hand cramp up as you desperately try to spin that stupid fucking disc thing fast enough to not instantly fail Jump and Jack Flash while digging a ridge into the screen, while also trying to have enough time to recover for the next beat, and I think it would be nice if there was some way to guarantee that future generations will still have the chance to have that experience. Or maybe just so that I can have that experience still when I'm older. Who's to say? Anyways, that's the end of the video, and thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. I tried to make a shorter one this time. Mileage kind of varied on that one, my apologies. And also wanted to try making one without breaking it up into parts to see if I liked this sort of structure of it, so I hope you enjoyed that as well. This video is a member's choice video, meaning that the people who pay $5 a month or more to support this channel got to vote for it a little while back. And if you want to have a say in my future content, you can become one yourself to vote on the September video. The topics are: how buried stars get social media toxicity right. This video would be a return to Buried Stars, focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. Why social skills actually matter in competitions. This video would explore how social skills work as both offensive and defensive tools in competitive environments, and why that's important. The content creator crisis of the commons. This video would explore how online content is a uniquely modern crisis of the commons, and how that impacts the relationships between viewers, creators, and content. Gen AI is a society-wide prisoner's dilemma, and we're not going to solve it in time. This video would be about the nature of the economic time bomb that is generative AI, and why the people with the power to defuse it are basically guaranteed to refuse to do so. Memberships cost $5 a month through YouTube and Patreon, both of which are linked below, and voting will run until the end of the day on September 10th. If you're already a member, you can go find the voting link down below, so make sure to go vote. Speaking of September 10th, that'll also be the final day to submit for the Virtual Killing Academy streams. Last year I put together a bunch of streams where people could submit their VTuber designs and OCs to be put into a Danganronpa simulation, and we're doing that again this year as well. If you'd like to be a part of it, links in the description to sign up and send in your details. Also, the pre-order campaign for the Wiggler pins has now ended. If you did pre-order one, make sure to check your emails for the invoice, and I hope you're as excited as I am for them. We crossed 43 pre-orders, which means that not only are we getting the pins, but we're also going to be getting matching stickers, so that'll be fun. Last thing, but thank you very much to all my channel members, both now and back when this video was selected in May. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele and Robot Juice. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Angitenar, Ghostbat, Bailey Nichols, and Cavi Corbin. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Dextiny, Mini-Q, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavos, Crimson Cyclo, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Good Guy Luis, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safon, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Monica Linnell, Teo Tamara, and Please Like Me. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.